Members Tech Team meeting. Thank you for being here. I think this is such a great group to be part of. We have an interesting agenda today because both of these are sort of follow up or a different perspective on presentations that we had back in May. So this is a really interesting sort of linked agenda to what we did last time. So if we could just, do we usually do introductions in here? Yes, right. So can we just whip around real fast, say your name and your affiliation or your organization that you're with, and then I'll try to run through the people who are online real quick. Maddie, do you want to start?
I'm Maddie. I'm with the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
I'm Jamie Huff. I'm with the Utah Division of Emergency Management. I'm Brady with AECOM.
So Jim Ferris, Division of Water Quality.
Phil Brown, Great Salt Lake Branch Cooperative.
Ryan Doherty, Cargill Salt.
Brian Grew with the Utah Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining.
And Tom Wright with AECOM.
Brady Newton, AECOM.
Heidi Hoven, Gilmore Sanctuary, National Audubon Society.
I'm with Utah Geological Survey.
Angela Gong, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Lynn DeFreitas, Executive Director of Friends of Great Salt Lake.
Elliot Jagniecki, Utah Geological Survey.
I'm Jennifer Riggs with the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Okay, let me see these online people. I can always barely read from here. We've got Allison Barton, Amy Putman, Chelsea Cameron, Claire Spangenberg, Craig Miller, Elliot's here in person also, M. Clark, Emily Hamill, Jake Alexander, Jonathan Lumbach, Kim Coburn, Leanna Little-Wolf, Rob Dubuque, Steve Mooring, Thomas DeMars, Tom Wright, Xiaoban Jiang, and our other computer. Great. Welcome, computer. Thank you all for being here. A few updates. Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, we actually have our meeting tomorrow. If you can make it, it's going to be really interesting. It's going to be a deep dive into Phragmites treatment and updates on the research that we have and the efforts that we have going on, focused on Great Salt Lake, but of course there's a lot of Phragmites work on Utah Lake as well. Keith Hambrecht is spearheading that, but we're actually going to have about 7 or 8 people speak to different aspects of Phragmites research. So what's the problem? How does it alter hydrology? How about vegetation and habitat? How do we measure how much there is, looking at some remote sensing stuff? And then what does restoration look like? So it's going to be a really interesting meeting if you can make it either in person or online. That's tomorrow. Great Salt Lake Salinity Advisory Committee, our last meeting was canceled, one that we were just going to have last week. In October 23rd, I think is what it is. And then at the end of the tech team meeting today, I'm going to take about 10, 15 minutes to talk through the fiscal year 27 grant applications. We're making a few adjustments and we're trying to dramatically change the timeline so that it's just, people can apply much earlier in the year and then know whether they're funded or not much earlier in the year, and that the contracting, which can take forever, will still have done by the beginning of the fiscal year, which has not been the case. So I'll talk more about that later. Our two items today are having Jamie and her team talk about Great Salt Lake, their flood map modeling, and this was interesting. Jamie can talk more about sort of how this came to be. And then our second item is looking at lithium sourcing in Great Salt Lake with Elliot Jagniecki. So here we go. Jamie, take this off.
Wasn't sure if any others were coming, so thanks. Thanks for having us. Like I said, my name's Jamie Huff. I'm with the Utah Division of Emergency Management. You might wonder why we're here. We actually do have a regulatory program in emergency management. It's a floodplain management program. So I focus on floodplain mapping, so mapping flood risk all across the state. And then we also have a team of folks that work on floodplain management, so helping implement flood maps. And they are typically used at the local level. They can be used by everyone, but they are typically used at the local level to develop permits, floodplain development permits. So ultimately, all of the information that we do is utilized for development and is safely in and around floodplains. So this particular study came to be quite a while ago, probably 2017, 2018. It was requested by Salt Lake County. And but then we decided it's not just a Salt Lake County issue, it is a 5-county issue. So we embarked on studying the entire flood risk of the Great Salt Lake. And I fully recognize it's a little interesting right now because we don't, there's, you know, lakes at almost its historic low, but there is a flood risk. Hopefully we can, you know, get Great Salt Lake back up to what it was, and look at the flood risk around the lake. So we've started this study, like I said, back in about 2018, 2019, and have done some hydraulic modeling. And there are some really key points of information that I think might help you in whatever research you're doing. So we have hired our team here, AECOM, that's why they're here today, to give you all the details of the study that we're doing. So this is going to be available to everybody and will ultimately be used again at the local level for development purposes down the road. So yeah, so I'll turn it over to you guys and feel free to ask questions and yeah,
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Jamie. I'll share my screen if that's okay. Presentation we get into. Let's see. Whoa. That's interesting. All right, I'll try to get this in official mode here. All right. So the title of this is Adjourn finally sees 360 degrees. We just did this a very similar presentation in Louisiana to a bunch of coastal modelers. We have an embedded joke in here. When coastal modelers do their work, they are basically looking at 90 to 100 to 120 degrees depending on the shape of the coast. They're getting winds from one primary direction, and this is just a little jab at them this last spring to say, we're doing a full circle model here. It points to the very unique nature of the lake. I know this crew is very, very familiar with a lot of the things that go on in this lake and the terminal nature of the lake. We ran into a lot of challenges as we tried to get the statistics right to come up with the still water elevation and then look at the winds in the area given the amount of data and history that we have. We'll go through a very quick overview of the study that we've done, and we can keep it very informal. You guys can pick up the presentation, ask questions as needed. So this was funded by Jamie's foresight, basically, on unifying the flood risk assessment of the entire shoreline of Great Salt Lake. We entered this study. We have a lot of disparate data sets and approaches to what the lake risk is shown from the FEMA perspective. We'll talk about the need for the study and a little bit more. We'll give a little bit of background, but we won't need to do too much for this group. We'll dig in methodology and talk about challenges as they come up. Very unique lake that we're dealing with here. Very rare that we have studies addressing flood elevations of terminal lakes. A lot of it is based on predicting the future, which we're not that good at. FEMA does not allow it. We're not allowed to take future conditions or any future approaches to this study. And some of the things we had to do were just look backwards and try to apply that data as well as we could to the conditions today and in the high water elevations, the 80s and back in the 1800s, actually. So we'll go through these points very quickly. I think we all realize very shallow lake generally, when we're talking about big water supplies. Exceptionally high salinity. This made for a challenge where coastal models and the density of the water and the density of the air were actually different when we had to model them here. With lighter air, heavier water, we had to actually change the code in the coastal program to assess that, and it made the results not as, it did have an effect on wave heights and the results and whatnot. So it's just interesting to know right out of the gate, a lot of the programs that are used don't apply that well.
Is that the like U.S. Army Corps wave equation that they use for their modeling?
Yeah, so we did an AdCirc model, right? And so we used that, and then we were using different wave applications in a program called SWAN, which is the surge of the water. And then we used WAF as to do wave generation over the top of that for mapping purposes. But yeah, it's more FEMA specific than core, but there's a lot of overlap. Yeah. Then let's see, the other interesting thing that we'll get into is the split by the causeway here. Some historic footage. You can see Lake Bonneville in blue in the background, that ancient footprint. And then we have a historic low showing up there in 2021, which was right about the time we started ramping up this flood study, which made the messaging a little specific. 87, you can see this is when they had high water issues. We were pumping the West Desert. We had a lot of infiltration issues, a lot of treatment plant outfall issues in 87, and then 72, you can see like another very low cycle. So from 72 to 87, we really came up to a maximum historic high that, with people around. And then, within a couple decades, we're where we are today. So why is this study needed? Jamie did touch on this a little bit. There is development pressure around the perimeter of the lake. When we build something across it, something near it, we want to be able to account for wave action. We want to be able to make a consistent approach to, say, if UDOT is going to add something right on the periphery of the lake or increase the height of anything that they're doing there. The inland port and the state prison, they've popped right into the edge of where our study floods. And I think as this was happening, the pressure was building to get good data for these systems, for the state prison in particular. And then again, we're unifying these studies. There's FEMA, they use a lot of different approaches to risk, and we have all of those approaches on this lake. And we're consolidating it into one unified approach here. So we go to the next one. So the components of the study, we did flood frequency analysis. We used historic lake level data back to as far as it was recorded. And we did a very specific process to come up with a 1% and 0.2% still water elevations. And then from those boundaries, we added historic wind data and wind hydrographs to push the water one direction or another. We did that 36 different directions using binning winds in all these directions. And we used 2D techniques to generate that surge and the actual satiation of the lake around the perimeter in all directions. And then maybe events that haven't been seen yet, but we know are possible due to wind data. Let's see. We then take that analysis of the surge, and then we look at waves on top of that. And the wave analysis of 1D, we call them transects, and we interpolate between those transects. We did this around the entire perimeter of the lake, and we'll show some ideas. One of the things that we found interesting were the causeway in the middle of the railroad. We thought this would break up wave action as you get these long wind events across say the north arm down to the south arm. And then as we were collecting and reviewing the data of the causeway, you might recall some of the historic photos in the 80s where the causeway is above water. we discovered, we think the causeway sunk up to 8 feet in certain locations. And so that just amounted to a giant swath of the causeway underwater in the next 100-year event. And the waves just breaking cleanly over that. So we did not get that expected wave breakup from the causeway. That was just an interesting.
Did you say 8 feet? You thought it sunk 8?
8 feet. We think it's going to be 8 feet underwater. In certain parts of it, there's more. There's areas that are sinking a little faster, and the Union Pacific Railroad, they spend about $10 million a year raising the ballast. They're constantly out there raising that up, and I think they would work a little harder once the lake started coming up to keep it above. Now, this is an interesting point. When we work with FEMA, we can't predict that the Union Pacific Railroad is going to raise that up. We have to use the current conditions, so we weren't allowed to use the causeway to break up wave generation. That's an interesting FEMA framework there. Here's some photos of just sinking lake bed over the years. The causeway sinking, the culverts that connected the north and south arms, they slowly either became unsafe or became clogged due to sinking of sediment, and we lost a lot of connectivity between the north-south arm. There is as I think we all know, there's a formal breach now in a more stable location of the causeway that allows continuous flow to the north from the north to south. There's bidirectional flow of different density currents of more saline water flowing into the south and fresh water flowing over the top end of the north. The ballast used to be more permeable, and we think that's less permeable now, and more the majority of the mixing goes on to that about 185-foot opening in the causeway now. Here's an interesting graphic to just absorb for a second. You can see the data density of lake elevation measurements on this chart. In the 1850s, they were measuring the lake twice a year, trying to catch a high and a low. They did that for years and years, decades, until the equipment got better, population grew. Now we have continuous data. We have one of the more complicated and impressive attempts to the USGS has done to capture the bidirectional flow at the causeway breach, or the railroad breach. And you can see the later portion of this chart. This actually was another issue for us as we're coming with volumes. You can see the north arm and the south arm start to diverge. And at certain points, once the causeway wasn't allowed to have water flow back and forth, we would see about a 3-foot difference in the data on a north and south arm. And now with the opening, we think that would, besides a density differential holding the water up a little higher, we think that's going to solve that lost storage in the north arm, if you will, from the flooding perspective. When we looked at the volumes, we wanted to fill up both north and south arm and equalize them to one elevation in this study. So there's other big historic data points when we started pumping the West Desert. You can see from just these wet cycles that have happened in the 80s, this was 5 wet years. That took us from a pretty low event in the lake up to record high. So this is a jet stream trying to predict wind. We're not allowed to try to predict future jet stream in these studies, but we think that that is still possible. We could get a 5-year cycle at some point, and this study would be very relevant. Right now, it's 5 years out, if you will. So one of the project challenges for this, and I'll try to go through this pretty quickly, and please check time every now and then. If we're going over, I apologize. This is a autocorrelation concept that we had applied to the data. When we are doing frequency analysis or statistics, we need a random variable, and the lake elevation itself is not a random variable. This is showing a memory of the lake elevation in the Great Salt Lake from year to year, and a wet cycle will be remembered by the lake elevation due to the rate of evaporation and everything else for at least 12 years. When an autocorrelation factor, just fun fact, when it drops below 0.4, then the data feels random at that point. What you can see in this chart is the randomness starts to begin about 12, maybe 15 years out, and then it becomes kind of unpredictable. So we couldn't use traditional statistics to do this. We did literature searches on past studies. USU is a lot of different studies on this lake. A lot of times they were looking at statistical water balances. They looked at historical studies. Davis County did a coastal study. It was the only county that had wave action in the FEMA results. And then there's a similar lake up in North Dakota's Devil's Lake. They used two very different methods to try to determine the flood risk for their terminal lake up there. We could not use these methodologies based on, they had slightly better data historically, and also the results gave a wide range of elevations of volumes, and we couldn't introduce that much uncertainty into our study. So we chose a method using total probability theorem, which is done on Great Lakes by the Army Corps of Engineers, where we take different probability curves and combine them using the theorem. How we broke the Salt Lake apart, the Great Salt Lake apart, is we have a duration curve where we can look backwards on what the elevation of the lake has been since we've known it, and then we can look at seasonal fluctuations or half-year fluctuations in the variation of the elevation of the lake in any given 1 year. Then we can combine those two data sets into a response curve, and then we can get a frequency curve to give us a result for the still water elevation, which is a volume that then we resolve to an elevation, obviously. This is an example of the duration curve. This is just using percent time exceeded and the volume of the lake given the history. And this, what we found is the 1% chance was about 30 million acre feet of water. And when we use these two frequency, we use these two data sets to combine them, we have fluctuations also. So the duration curve and the random variable for fluctuations combines together to give us a CFA result. And then our result for this, and again, this is the starting point of this analysis, is 4214.82 is what we think 30.11 million acre feet of water results to in the 1%. We did the same thing for what we call 0.2% or 500 year. And we then take these still water results, skip this slide, wordy, and then we start adding it to our wave and wind effects, or wind and wave effects, I should say. Our 2%, this new elevation is 4216.04, and all these datums are ABD 88 right now. This is an example of Utah Lake where we have some final mapping results. These are draft, not officially approved by FEMA, but they're on the way. So this is the 360 part of the study. We have intensity and duration data from the airport with a lot of other wind data from the University of Utah, but we ended up going back to the airport data and applying that to the majority of the lake, checking it with some of the other more provisional data that's out there right now. This was done to determine the wind direction in each, the statistics, the wind direction in each direction. We did an extreme value analysis. And this is an example of fetch lengths going across the major directions on the lake, passing right by the causeway. And you can see the transects around the edge of will end up being the final mapping results, where we will interpolate between those transects and have the final mapping product. This is a couple results from the wind study. This is in any given direction, the 1.2% winds. And then we have to take historic storms plus what we come up with in the wind data and create a wind hydrograph. And you can see an example of two very different wind hydrographs at 200 degrees and 30 degrees, where you have much higher wind in a shorter sustained period. And then at the 30-degree direction, you have a lower sustained wind speed and like a longer duration. So you get different effects pushing the water up one direction on the lake. This is just a note on our density of our model. This is the AdCirc model element density. We had over 1 million elements in this model. You can go much larger when you have open waters, but when you get to causeway, when you're around the shores, when you're around the bays, you want much better, tighter data to reflect how the wind and wave actions happen. And then this is one of our full circle results of the lake. This is the 1% data. Still water elevation is what we'll call this. And from the 4214 in the middle, it surges up to 4219, in some cases 4220, around the edge, and then we end up adding waves to that data. This might work, it might not. This is just an example of one of the directions in the AdCirc model. Did that go? Yeah. So you'll see the surge on one side, and then if you look very closely, as it passes, you get a sation back to the other side of the lake. We did a pseudo calibration with this in friction values. We know, looking at buoy data, that there's about a 6-hour period of the sation of the lake, and we were getting results very similar to that in this model. So we felt like it was doing a good job holding the water, pushing the water with the wind, and whatnot. So let's see. Go to the next one. Brady, do you want to talk about this slide?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we talked about WAFIS. So WAFIS is FEMA's way to analyze waves. And WAFIS is an acronym that stands for Wave Height Analysis for Insurance Studies. And Tom mentioned that this kind of 2D analysis with AdCirc transfers into a 1D analysis at the shore, where we have transects perpendicular to the shore. We run these waves. And so this analysis moves landward along the transect, taking topography and bathymetry into account. And then we did a bunch of field work to categorize and look at types of vegetation and buildings around the perimeter lake, because all vegetation, all buildings will decrease wave height. So we look at marsh plants, the plant diameters, get an average of those things, tree diameters, get an average of those things, put them into this model. And then out of this model, we get these specific zones. If you ever looked at a FEMA map, you've got your V zones, which include wave action, and then you go into your coastal A zones as you get further away from the lake, and then into your traditional AE and X zones there. Next slide. And so what we get here is, so this is the Utah Lake example, which will be going effective next year, and did very similar analysis. It wasn't quite as complicated. It's not a terminal lake, it's not a saltwater lake. So you can see what we come up with as we interpolate where we have a dense, well, what we do is we take the populated areas, like Tom said, and we put a more dense transect alignment on those. We interpolate between transects to look just like you would do on cross sections on a river. We interpolate between those transects to get zoning between transects, and you can see here in this slide what that final product would look like with zones and elevations inside those zones of what the water surface elevation will be. And then, so the final product that we're looking at here, this is how it's all going to be paneled out. You can see in the populated areas much smaller panels, meaning map panels, so you can see the more detail for Salt Lake, Davis, Weber, and Box Elder County, and then the middle part of Tooele County, and then larger panels on the western shore because there's not much population or development there. And yeah, That's it.
Yeah, just give you a high level overview of this. Hopefully that was enough time.
Can you go back to that last?
I'm sure I can. Sure I can.
I guess my question is, sort of as the outcomes of this study, are they, is it just analytical to say, here are these different risks, or this is what it looks like? Are they, do you give recommendations like, hey, the flood risk could be mitigated in these areas with some different actions? I mean, how far does this study go?
So this identifies the hazard, right? And we do not suggest mitigations for the high water. What we would expect through the regulatory process is if someone's intersecting one of these floodplains or one of these coastal zones, that they would be aware of it, then look up this data and say size their embankments correctly, riprap armoring, stay away, whatever this happens to be. The different zones, I'm not sure what slide you want to go back to, but you can see these VE zones. These are where kind of building codes change and things change in FEMA's world a little bit. On the coast, you'll see a lot of houses on stilts, where you want to keep the wave action moving underneath the property or the structure. So you don't want to obstruct that. What we found out here is our VE zones are offshore a bit. So we won't have wave action higher than 3 feet on the shoreline because you need about 6 feet of water to generate a 3-foot wave, right? So these are depth limited waves, and they in the modeling and mapping shows it VEs in deeper water, and then it just kind of disappears as you get close to the coast, shoreline, I should say. Keep saying coast. Was this the slide you wanted to look at? Was there another?
Maybe the map.
So just the last one with the different blocks.
Oh, the panels.
Yeah, the panels.
So those, yeah, that's the data that's going to be given to the communities. So this is a community-driven data set, and it can be used for state, federal, whoever for development purposes. That would be the data that would be given, because we have it. So why this study is a little unique. We keep calling it coastal because FEMA doesn't have a difference between shoreline and coastal. They only have a couple models to choose from to analyze wave action. So it is in FEMA's eyes a coastal study, but obviously we're not the coast. So this was the only way to get our hurricane force winds included and analyzed into our flood analysis. So, but the intent is to give this data to the communities so they can implement it through their own floodplain management programs. So if there is, say, a mitigation of some kind or some development happening, they would be using this this data set for permitting and things like that. Yep, that's the intent.
Does this in any way integrate like floodplains from rivers or other drainage tributaries that are coming into the lake, and then how that's dispersed?
Absolutely. Yes. So I'll let you talk specifics, Tom, but right now I know the team is working on all of the 36 tributaries.
Second bullet up here, we've got 84 miles of riverine study that we're taking into account. So we're looking at that interface between the riverine flood hazards and the Great Salt Lake flood hazards to develop new mapping and analysis there.
And then the hydrology that was done, not just for the modeling itself, but the hydrology that was done that would include all of the inflows of tributaries. Yep. I don't know, Tom, if you want to add to that.
I think that's it.
How far out is implementation, or what's the process? Like, it has to go through FEMA first after you finalize your.
Unfortunately, FEMA's process is not fast. So we have we have several steps of review for FEMA. So there's milestones that we have to provide to FEMA for them to review it. They have reviewed the modeling and the hydrology of this study. Right now, the team is working on the tributaries. So the still water elevation and the wave heights that Tom was talking about aren't going to change, once unless we get some major feedback from communities. But I don't foresee that, but we'll allow that feedback because it's a very complicated model. But then we'll get the tributaries included, and then we add those to the FEMA product panels that you would see. I don't know if you've seen a FEMA map before, but we have to get them into FEMA products. And then we have a due process. We release them as preliminary and then go through a due process so anyone can appeal if they don't like the information, but they have to appeal with data because we've put a lot of effort and time into this. So if there's data that we missed, we want to see it, obviously, before we get to a prelim, but there will be a due process. And then once we finalize the maps, there's a 6-month adoption period. So I don't foresee this going effective final probably like 2029 or 30, somewhere in there. It's just a snail pace. But this is the second study, Utah Lake being the first study that has ever used this method within the state. I don't foresee us doing this study in any other lake, but we do have lakes that have these high wave actions. So yeah, it's interesting.
Part of this, sorry.
Go ahead.
Part of this risk assessment, does it entail any like liquefaction or zones where like you have soft sediment, if it even just gets a little splashed and you get slumping, collapse?
No. We there is wave run up that we would show cresting over dikes or things like that, right? But no earth movement, no failures.
That would be, for the other people that don't take your information and work with the engineering aspects.
Yeah, there is a process after this major study is complete to revise the maps on their own. Like, so say you have a mitigation project or some kind of development that occurs that might change the shoreline a little bit. There is a process in between large mapping studies for like developers to update the information. But yeah, like I said, this is the first ever that we've had this analysis. Oh, and where I was going with that is Tooele, Box Elder, and to some extent Weber don't really have information right now to use at all. Weber does. It's not as detailed. But there's not really information to show where that flood elevation would be around the lake. So there's no regulatory development requirements. So if as development pushes towards the lake, there's not really any requirement to take a look at it. But this data at this moment can be used because it is brand new and what we call best available data for communities to utilize. Davis County, you mentioned the core study, that Davis County is the only one that has that study currently that has more details to it. So it has a flood elevation currently that they can be using. Salt Lake to some extent has a lesser shoreline flood risk identified. So.
The question back here.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just in comparison with the study versus the previous study, the study will increase basically the floodways by about a couple feet.
Great question. So Davis County had a varying flood elevation between I think 19 and 20, and we're right around there. So for the one study where they had information, we came in very close to their elevations. And I would say we're more refined because we have more directions. We looked at more wind data. More transects to get a better nuance on that. But as we go around the lake, there was a zone A for Salt Lake. And when they were doing the prison, how high should we go to prison? And this was a question before the study started. We started looking at it just casually, it's really hard to answer. So people were saying, let's keep things above 4220. And we're seeing a little inundation on that side of the lake. We're just into the outskirts of the prison right now.
Yeah, so zone A is an approximate
Yeah.
zone, flood zone. It doesn't have any elevation data tied to it. So we're coming in with these,
But as far as like spatial inundation,
it'll be a little bigger because of the wave analysis.
and the still water, your still water is higher.
So the water will be a little higher depending on the area, right? And then waves on top of that.
So the spatial content on this.
Yep.
Yeah.
The footprint will be bigger.
And it certainly will be in Tooele and Box Elder because they don't have anything right now.
Yeah.
So that will be brand new to them, so that we'll message that. We've been talking to the counties, so they know what's coming, but.
Good question. And another.
You kind of mentioned the effective vegetation on kind of the wave action and the run up. Do you have any insight on like of vegetation buffer and the effects of that on the extent?
Oh, yeah, great. So in general, the vegetation helps arrest waves. It'll slow things down, it'll move the water less. We think that's a good practice, just generally, to have the vegetation everywhere. But it was essentially slowing down our wave action as waves were forming through those marshes.
Big time.
Yeah.
What was the vegetation data that they used as input?
Field work. We went around and selected certain, depending on, we did some desktop analysis to see where we wanted to go. We don't have that. It's in the report. There's a report that's available you can look at. We went to 50 or 60 sites around the lake to get kind of representative samples of what the vegetation was, how dense the grasses were, what the sizes of the marsh plants were, or trees, or whatever it was, and then input those into the WAPIS model. Does that answer your question?
It's a very custom,
So would it be kind of correct to assume that the impounded wetland areas are protective of infrastructure?
100%.
Vegetated.
Vegetated wetlands.
Any other questions? Anyone online? Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. I will say that most of us spend all day thinking about the lake drying up, so this is a different.
It is a bit ironic, we understand that, but it is using, the vast amount of historic data, and they are snapshots in time too. So if it needs to be updated in the future, there's a process to now do that. So.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Elliot, do you want to hop on? As you're pulling that up, can I ask one more question? You mentioned several times you can't use projections or predictions into the future. Is that a recent change, or has that always been how FEMA has done things?
It has always been. So FEMA doesn't allow you to count a project that's not funded yet, as an example, and it extends to all sorts of other. How do you pretend that the causeway is going to be above? But we also don't catch the policy changes here. But something that the state can produce is something we call non-regulatory data. So we could do another version of this map, say where we put the still water right up to where it's spilling into the West Desert. And then we could run the same analysis everywhere. And that would be essentially a future different condition. And we could do whatever we wanted with or without causeway with that, whatever the communities would want. But that'd be a whole separate process, and it wouldn't be tied to insurance. So just keep that in mind, yeah.
So the capability, I think, is there to do the future conditions, but in terms of getting it to an effective product that's used for floodplain management and engineering purposes, we can't.
It's behaving.
Oh,
Thank you.
how do I do the slideshow?
Sometimes it's slideshows. Do you have two screens sometimes?
I do.
Sometimes it's slideshows on your other screen. Jen, you know how to make it not do that.
Tires.
There you go.
Yeah. It's doing window and not entire screen. Okay.
Okay, take it away.
Let's look on that hide so it doesn't cover.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so this was a GSL Tech Team awarded grant for 2025, looking at lithium sourcing into the lake. I know this has been kind of a hot topic for pilot test programs around particularly the North Arm of Great Salt Lake, extracting lithium from the lake brine, producing lithium as a byproduct. So what we really wanted to do is get a handle on, we know what's in the lake volumetrically and by mass of lithium, but what is contributing to the source? And we have some historic data that shows that things have been pretty steady in concentration of lithium for the last 10, 20 years. And we want to kind of figure out why is that happening? Is there another source or multiple sources that are contributing to the overall lithium load in the system? This is kind of a precautionary approach or holistic in terms of if people want to start extracting lithium on the lake, how long is that resource going to last? Is it manageable? Is it good for the ecosystem? So that's mainly the reason why we did this. The picture that you see in the foreground here is a giant spring pool that was, I can't remember the elevation, but basically during the 80s and then into the last several decades, it was covered with water. And this is a subaqueous spring at times, but now it's exposed. And it's about 20 feet across, 15 feet deep, and it spews out maybe 100 gallons per minute of water. And it has decent concentrations of lithium.
Where's that?
North Arm near Spring Bay, where there's no vegetation. So yeah, that's basically the overall purpose and how mineral resources on Great Salt Lake brine impacts lake ecosystem and what the economic viability is for extraction. Stakeholder interest, in the last several years has risen, particularly for lithium from continental brines, or custom deposits, for use of batteries, electronics, industrial applications. The estimated resource currently, and this is from Andrew, who couldn't be here today, he's in the field, ranges between 360,000 to 460,000 metric tons within the overall system of Great Salt Lake. That includes South and North Arm. And historically, that range has kind of bounced up and down based on rise of lake elevation, evaporation, dilution, and from extraction. So based on production of mineral commodities, that's your magnesium, your potassium, and what is sitting in these evaporation ponds, and also the stockpiles of the residuals left over from those processes to get those metals and minerals, about 200,000 tons or 1.1 metric LCE, which is lithium carbonate equivalent, has been removed from the system from 1988 to 2021. That's kind of our estimate. So even though that's been lost, we see a trend from the 90s all the way to present that the resource within the lake has been pretty stable. So why is that occurring? And that kind of jumps into the question, what are these sources? Are they springs? Is it groundwater feeding the system? Is it sediments that are leaching lithium from ionic bonds? So we wanted to try to get a better sense of this. So as you know, South and North Arm split by the causeway. North Arm is more saline, more dense. These are our typical UGS's sampling sites. These two in the North Arm are no longer because the lake level is so low that we can't get a boat up there to sample. So we have one sample site near the spiral jetty up here. And then these are our South Arm locations. And of course, USGS also has their G-SLEP sampling areas as well. And so the graph on the right basically shows density against lithium concentrations. And overall, with lower end of density, there is a nice linear trend, but when you get higher in salinity, higher density, you get basically a shotgun pattern, and everything gets pretty scattered. So it's not really a good reference of what the lithium concentration is doing when you try to plot it against salinity. So here's the resource trends that I was talking about. You can see from the 1970 into the mid 80s, things kind of are jumping around, especially when we had those flooding events, concentration went down. And then we had the West Desert pumping of brine into the Inland Basin. And then after that, basically the concentration or tons of massive lithium have remained around that 440. Oops. And then this plot on the right just shows a comparison of lithium with, or magnesium, potassium in comparison to the lithium trend. So even though things are extracted for those metals, those actually remain pretty consistently steady as well. So there is replenishment into the system, and what that is probably a ton of different reasons. Okay, so background rivers and upstream tributaries, they supply lithium, but it's pretty low in concentration. The highest is going to be further to the north, where you have more hydrothermal input from hot springs, like the Malad River tributary system, the Crystal Hot Springs, all that near Idaho, that drain into the Bear, and the Bear eventually drains into the South Arm. In general, the north and south arms, their average south is 45 to 60, or I mean, north is 45 to 60, south 15 to 25 milligrams per liter in concentration. Groundwater and solutes are estimated recently from a couple different studies, about 10% to 12 of total water input. In previous studies, going back decades ago, 3% was kind of the main guess of how much groundwater is coming into the system. So that's a major game changer in terms of how much solutes are actually entering the system if groundwater is playing that major role. From that, you can estimate what the lithium's residence time is in the lake, and it's roughly 14 to 1600 years. So it's fairly conservative in the north arm, and then a little less in the south arm. But that does not include any recycled lithium from the playas, the groundwater on the playa sediments entering the system, clays that are binding the lithium or absorbing lithium to them, and then chemically reacting and releasing that over time. One study that is a hallmark is Kevin Perry's dust study, because he went all the way around the lake and sampled very fine sediment that was at the surface, prone to becoming dust particles. And he did analyze for lithium, and he got this big range of numbers depending geographically where you are. That higher end is usually associated with drainage from the solar ponds or any industrial interaction that's draining off the playa into the lake. And then a couple other groundwater studies, but those ranges were low in the wetlands, 0.001, and then closer to the North Arm shores up to 50 milligrams per liter. But that data was fairly sparse. So what we are looking at, we targeted springs. So right here, there's that mega spring that we showed. That's about 5.86 milligrams per liter. We wanted to look at shallow groundwater levels or tables around the periphery of the shore, and then kind of transect its way to higher inland areas to see what chemical gradients of lithium was doing from outboard to inboard towards the lake. We sampled a bunch of clay, as much as we could around the lake, but the clay was sampled in the subsurface, whereas Kevin Perry's, everything was on the surface because it was focused on dust. And so those soils were heavily evaporated, and so that could be the other impact of his higher concentrations, is a capillary force of groundwater wicking to the surface and then concentrating a evaporated brine. So, but we wanted to see what the clay was doing in interaction with the water table. Ooids, volumetrically around the whole lake. Thick ooid beds all over. Probably 10 feet to more of just ooids. Lots of ooids. There's a geologic story behind that. So we sampled ooids.
You just like that word, actually.
You could call it oids, you know, it's kind of fun. Also, these microbialites that are old, these are ancient microbialites that are basically cemented up with carbonate cement. Both the ooids and these microbialites, the main mineral is aragonite. It's just a high magnesium calcium ratio of carbonate in it. And we did some transects on these microbialites, and you can see the clotted fabric in the middle has higher lithium than the laminated. Or about the same, actually. I can't see the yellow. Yeah. Anyways, that's interesting. And it's kind of on par with a range of what the ooids have. So there's like a story there of the timing between the ooids and these ancient microbialites. We also have a core from the North Arm when AMCO was up there drilling for oil. They took a core of basalt, that's the reservoir for the very low API oil. And it's full of these zeolites that are carbonate cement, so we measured those just to see if any of that could contribute to a release of lithium through the fracture system in the north. So going into the results, this is kind of a show tell of a heat map of our data points in the dark green, showing lithium concentrations of sediment from the subsurface, and then Kevin Perry's data of the dust. And you can see that this really hot spot over here, this is where Morton Salt's drainage canal is kind of coming in right there. So that's probably your 485 ppm of lithium. But you can kind of get a sense that there are various places that are a little more dark red, light red. That could be a sample discrepancy of spacing. But for the most part, sediment has lithium in it everywhere. The cross plot shows Kevin's data here. Again, his concentrations are higher, and we're plotting it against magnesium because magnesium is a good proxy for clay. So what kind of clays are in the soil, in the surface soil and then in the subsurface. Our clay samples are the triangles, so they fit fairly nicely in agreement with his, a little lower because again, these are in the subsurface, not at the top of exposure and evaporated. And then our ooids in circles, our microbialites here and here, kind of bracketing where the ooids are. And then we have evaporites, which are fairly low. Halite, which precipitates in the North Arm, virtually has like no lithium in it. Maybe in fluid inclusions, that's entrapment of liquid within the crystal. And gypsum, which grows on the playa margins in the mud, has very low lithium. But what's interesting, in the wintertime, the North Arm gets saturated with a mineral called mirabolite, and it creates this slush, and it builds up on the berms from wind action, and it can be a meter thick in places based on how much wind velocity is transporting that, and it absorbs a lot of the lithium that is in the North Arm reservoir, actually decreasing the reservoir by about 25–30%. So pilot study by Waterleaf started around this time when this was precipitating, which would drop your lithium load entering their processing system. And then what's going into their tanks could also precipitate this sludge, this crystalline sludge, because it's cold outside and it's in a metal tank. Also around the lake, in places you get these sulfate-rich springs, which are fairly concentrated with lithium in its groundwater. High density of sulfate, it precipitates these mirabolite spring mounds, but the lithium in those crystals are lower, much lower than what's in the North Arm. But it shows that the groundwater in various places have variable concentrations of lithium. So don't pay too much attention to this ternary, but it's basically just grouping all these red circles and binning it into 2 different brines for groundwater, calcium sulfate, calcium chloride. And that's what we see around the whole lake. Rivers are here in these X's, so they're kind of more bicarbonate dominant, as you would expect, drainage off the mountains, more carbonate, more calcium. And so this is the distribution of lithium from the groundwater, and compilation with a recent study by Bunce et al. 2025, grouping their data with ours. And you can see a couple hot spots, especially over here. This is where sulfate springs are. Down here, sulfate springs near the marina, or Great Salt Lake State Park. Up here, we have barite springs that are fairly concentrated in lithium too. Those are associated with the tar seeps. And then a couple variable places around Locomotive Springs. Right up here is where that giant spring is on the first slide. And so a lot of the area over here, you just can't really get to unless you spend hours of time, which we didn't have. So it would be nice to continue on, basically. So lithium in the water versus the magnesium again shows a nice trend, other than these more diluted low lithium measurements. If you remove those, you'd probably have a pretty nice linear trend here. And basically what it's showing is that you have this groundwater coming from springs or in the groundwater table, and it's probably interacting with the clays, maybe liberating lithium from the clays that lithium is absorbed to. And these are just some examples of all these different types of springs that discharge on the playa. And whether or not that discharge is going to make it to the lake, you're talking about just a drop in a couple feet of lake elevation. You could be kilometers away from the point source of these springs. But give it time, it's going to critically flow through the media towards the lake at that low relief gradient. And these are springs that we were able to get discharge on. So fairly low discharge for the most part, which could be measurable. But basically what it's showing, the higher TDS, the more salinity in these springs, the higher lithium concentrations. And based on those discharge estimates and really strong estimates, you can sum up all those discharges, the lithium content, and you can kind of start ballparking, okay, this is that concentration, that's this, let's add them together. And out of the 28, we calculated 47.5 metric tons of contribution from just those 28 springs. And those are springs that have discharge measurements. So a lot of them you can't measure discharge or seepage rate without really focusing on one location and studying the heck out of it for years. But if you were to somehow be able to do that in the circumference of the whole lake, and you knew what the overall lithium concentration is in the groundwater table, you could get a probably better estimate of what is traveling into the system and rejuvenizing the reservoir over time. So this is just a summary. Clays are a major component. The carbonate, which is aragonite in the ooids, is a big component, which those ooid grains, they can get weathered by chemical processes, meteoric water, changing different states of the brine, pH redox that can help dissolve some of the aragonite, release the lithium. Also with the microbialite, old microbialites. And I didn't touch on this, but the lake detritus, we were able to sample some of the bottom sediments in the south arm, and that had a fairly decent amount of lithium. Let me go back to that. That was the diamond up here, which is close to where the clays were. And so that muck, the lake detritus, is mostly organic ooze, fecal pellets, brine shrimp. So some of the lithium could be absorbed to the organics or hanging out with these subaqueous clays. And basically the evaporites didn't hold too much except for what forms in the north arm during the winter. And the groundwater seems to be fairly elevated with lithium. It's a probably a main source that contributes to the overall load. So based on this short little study, it didn't really change our resource evaluation. It still was at the steady state from these dates of 2024 in the June to March of 2025. Nothing really changed. That's what these data are right there. So in the future, what would be really cool and not as invasive, of course, we want more data. We want to poke more holes, drill wells, analyze water. I think it would be really cool to do a Sentinel multispectral satellite approach where you could get an idea of what seepage looks like on the surface, and then you could start spectrally mapping that out. And if you had ground truth data to match what that imaging does with some type of flow, then you can start really going around the whole entire lake and working at that. Yeah, and basically more chemical data from various places that we couldn't get to, particularly the Newfoundland Basin. Be really interesting to see what lithium concentrations are over there, which was extracted from the high stand of the 80s and then dumped over there, if it's concentrated or not. This solar ponds, evaporation ponds, we don't really know what's in them. You know, Compass has theirs on the west side and it drains through the Graves Trench all the way across the lake. We still don't know what's on the west side. We also don't know how the Newfoundland Basin is draining back into the lake and what that route is, and what it's bringing in as solutes, raising salinity. In the queue right now, I do have lithium isotopes being worked on with the carbonates and the brines, and that will help us see where did this lithium actually come from? Is it all from weathering, or was it from some period of time when we had magmatic sources? We have lots of young volcanism around the area, especially to the north. Was there an event at some period that just brought in a bunch of different solutes and hydrothermal, and that has contributed over time, or are things just slowly coming from those hydrothermal systems to the north and draining into the Bear River system? So yeah, that's it. That's basically everything in a nutshell. All right, I'll take any questions.
Jake, go ahead.
Hey, Elliot, thanks. That was really great synopsis and presentation of some really profound work that your team did. I guess my question mostly is based around, you know, you talk about investigating and sampling subaqueous lake springs. And my question is, are these more like cold water or warm water, hot water? Do you think there's a geothermal play potentially at depth with respect to like a basal brine? Kind of, you know, from 10,000 feet, you know, do you think that could be a significant contribution to this recharge we're seeing long term?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there are close proximity hot springs near Corinne that are at the surface. Some of these bigger old springs that are now exposed, they have some age dates that are thousands of years old, so old water that could be recycling through or recirculating through basement, old Paleozoic rocks that have been hydrothermally altered. So yes, but we need more data. We need to age date more of these brines.
Okay. And then the other question I had was, you know, thinking back to like a reset, kind of like you were talking about, you know, like flooding the ponds, right? Like the 83 flood, when Compass's pods were reconnected to the lake and the west ponds, and there was flooding into, you know, the West Desert as well, though it started the Bonneville. You know, I know there's that gap in the data series, right? Where I'm trying to remember, and you didn't show it in this presentation, but you know, that long-term resource about, yeah, there it is. You know, do you think that was kind of that stabilization, and would there potentially have been an effect of the quality of the analysis that was done from the 70s to the 90s, and then we kind of get this like leveling off to where we started to measure it again? Or do you expect to see this kind of decrease with lake levels dropping and production staying about the same? Granted, you know, US Magnesium not doing what they're doing.
I have no idea. The analytical side, sure, methods have changed. Brines are really difficult to measure solutes from because of dilution, depending on what lab you use. So there's a caveat there, error. With magnesium, corporation closing and not sucking in as much brine, I guess we'll see what happens with the south arm. The north arm seems to bounce around on a seasonal effect from just the changes in the chemistry from temperature, cold to hot. And basically, the more concentrated the brine is, it's a relationship to evaporation. Hotter summers, longer summers. But to get at the steady state of resource, that's the overall question. Why is that happening? And I don't know. A lot of it could be just stored up in stockpiles where these companies are not utilizing the lithium, right? They're not processing for it. So it's just getting stowed away. And maybe that is what the decrease is over time, but then flatlining because I don't know what the production rates are, but that would be an Andrew question.
Thanks, Elliot.
Thanks, Jake. Other questions? Yeah, Christy.
I'm just curious if you guys have gone into those little ground spots that they've been finding in like Remington Bay and Chesapeake.
We did, and it's relatively low concentrations, but yeah, because when that was first investigated, I was like, oh, dang. Even in like the Hooper Hot Spring, which is just north of Farmington, right in here, it's an old hot spring that's mesothermal. It's not very hot, but now covered in frag that doesn't flow. That had fairly low lithium as well. So I think geographically it depends on what that deeper seated source is coming up through versus what is more of a shallow groundwater recharge off the mountain block.
So do you think lithium concentration would be correlated with beach?
Maybe if it's a hydrothermal related coincidence, but yeah.
Anyone else? Elliot, thank you. Really appreciate that. I have a brief overview of how we're thinking about the fiscal year 27 Great Salt Lake research grants. So I know that a lot of our academic folks who can often be here are not. They're probably doing academic things like teaching right now. But I wanted to give this overview so folks can know what changes to expect. And then I have a couple of open questions that I'd like some feedback about from people. So here are the three big questions that I've been thinking about how to approach fiscal year 27, different than fiscal year 26. In fiscal year 26, we made some adjustments. We expanded the hot topics to be more detailed than in the past. And that was partly to address the idea that we really are trying to concentrate on things that are going to inform and improve our management of the lake. And so we're trying to hone that a little bit and make it less just sort of open to anything and focus on what is it that's going to change, certainly our division and also help the other folks who are doing lake management. Second, so do we want to adjust that this coming year? Second question I've been thinking about is, do we want to adjust the application process and specifically thinking about the criteria or the scoring? And the third one is changing the timeline. So my answers at this point are, no, we don't want to adjust the hot topics. Let's leave them as they are. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. Slightly adjust the application, the criteria, but essentially keep it the same. And then change the timeline dramatically. There are some questions that I'd just like to go over, but I think this new timeline will be okay, even with this overlap with some of these other holidays and then this other big funding opportunity. It will be okay to make this big adjustment. That's my conclusion there. So here is an excerpt from the hot topics, and we had 9 of them last year, plus, did we have 8 of them plus 1 that was just an other category, or 9? I think it was 9, and then we had an additional other category. And what we did was we tried to more deliberately paint out some of the big questions that folks have about lake management specifically. So things that are directly going to translate into what can we do differently, or how can we connect more dots in our management. So this is an excerpt because I just wanted to show, to say, I think we should keep the big bucket categories the same, and I'll show you all the categories in case you don't have them memorized in just a second. But what I did do is make it less of a list. Last year we had sort of a sub-bullets of very specific, almost research questions. And we pulled back from that a little bit to say, for example, these are the kinds of questions we're interested in. But in making it more specific, we didn't want to, or so far in the direction of saying these are the exact research questions, and if you aren't researching these things, you're off our list. We wanted to say these are the broad questions, but oftentimes experts in the field know better than I do, certainly, what exactly is the edge of what we know and what we don't know. We do have a panel of people who are scoring and ranking these projects, and we have a really broad base of expertise in that group, which is really great and really helpful. But making them specific while still keeping them broad enough to say, we are looking for these kinds of things, and leaving it up to sort of professional judgment to say, how are we approaching those? So here's what we've got. There's that list. So you can just see those broad topics. So extremes of salinity matrix, how do they affect biota? What's going on with microbialites, looking at water budget management. And then what you can see is the current projects that we have right now. So the PI last name, and then we also made that adjustment where some of them are one-year projects. So for example, that Solomon, the Kettering, and then several of them are 2-year projects that are getting funding in fiscal year 26 and also fiscal year 27. What I think our approach will be, and I'd like your feedback on this, is to go ahead and keep those topics the same. We had considered maybe if there's a project already funded in that bucket, do we change the emphasis or do we take it off the list entirely? And I think the answer that we came to, as we talked about it as a division and also as a subcommittee last week with some folks from the tech team subcommittee, is no, let's just keep all of the topics because we anticipate things layering on to look at different aspects to continue a line of research. So we thought that these are the important questions, and not take them off just because they have a currently funded project. For example, in the water budget and management, you can see we have 3 different projects, and that's because they're looking at 3 pretty different aspects of water budget. And so we didn't want to take it off just because these folks are investigating some aspects. That's such a big and important topic. We still want to invite project proposals. Any feedback about that approach? Oh, brilliant! We're doing this right. If you think of feedback or adjustments later, or anyone online, or if you watch this later on YouTube and have a thought, go ahead and email me. But I'm hoping that this will be a good approach.
So did you
Yes.
have no proposals for salt balance?
Salt balance. I'm trying to remember. So these were the funded projects, and I can't tell you off the top of my head what proposals. I mean, we had a lot of proposals, and a lot of them were really great. We just were limited by budget. You know, if we had $1 million more, we just would have kept on projects. I can't remember which category, how the proposals were balanced across categories.
Do you still think 2 years is probably the more better approach for funding versus a 1 year? 1 year is just, it's so small and short that you have to really get your data collection done quick, and then you got to write it up.
Yeah. So we had a lot of, you can see we're almost split. We've got 3 1 year and 4 2 year, but Trevor's project is split across 2 things, so it shows up twice. And so does Reimer's actually. I think we had pretty strong feedback, especially from the academic folks who are saying the 2-year project allows more stability in grad student funding, so you know what to predict. And if you're doing anything with the growing season, turns out that doesn't line up with the fiscal year. So we had pretty strong positive feedback on the 2-year, but you can also see that we had some really strong 1-year projects as well that we were pretty happy with. So I think leaving that open and having people say we could accomplish this in 1 year, and I think with the thought that a lot of people have ideas for what they would do, but splitting it up instead of saying this is what first year, second year, they said this is what we'll do in 1 year, planning to come back the next year. And then some folks are saying we really do need a 2-year horizon, or at least one of them say needed sort of a year and a half, and so they were able to slot themselves into that 2 year.
Do you have any projects that aren't funded 1 year that you see return the following year, and is there any weight given to those at all?
Well, this will be my 2nd year doing this project. So, does anyone?
I would say like Andrew and I usually do every other year, just so we keep the pot available in case you need it. But that's kind of our approach, and then it gives us a break.
So for those that maybe weren't able to get funding, say last year, and maybe they resubmit for this coming year, like, is there any weight given to those?
So I know these scoring criteria are really tiny, and I tried to highlight one of the changes, so it's not super helpful. But the biggest category, and we changed this last year, and again, I'd like to keep this essentially the same. The biggest category for us was the potential to inform or improve Great Salt Lake management. Sometimes a project just is a little too far out. There's so many unknowns that we're like, this is a great question, but it's not hitting the top of our priority list. But in 2 years, turns out actually some of those things are answered. So it's not exactly a reprioritization, giving them extra points because they've returned, but it's more like we're acknowledging, we're looking for the change in knowledge over time, and we know that happens. So I think things that were in total unknown 5 years ago, people are saying, hey, we know a lot more about this, and it becomes a much more salient management question. Whereas, and again, some things we say, that's a great question, maybe not for our pot of funding, but hopefully it starts to get investigated, and then it will loop back at some different point in its development.
Does the committee provide feedback to applicants so you can tailor your application next year?
So I think in the past, and again, I've only done this last year, we didn't, for a couple of reasons. One was we had so many proposals last year. We just didn't have the bandwidth to give 40 project proposals detailed feedback. Another is the way that we ended up scoring people. We had a standardized way of scoring. So here's our criteria, it's out of this much. But we didn't centralize that in a meaningful way that we could then hand back to candidates. So I had my scoring, and as we brought the scores together, it just wasn't in a way that was shareable, if that makes sense. So a lot of people reached back out to me and I said, well, I have my feedback, but actually there were 8 people on this committee, and I don't think my feedback is particularly meaningful more than the 7 other people. So we just said, no, we don't give feedback. And I think we'll probably do something similar this year, depending on how many proposals we get, but just, I think the bandwidth mostly was an issue with that.
So I feel like if you keep the criteria stable, and even if you can just share like anonymized scores, like, hey, you ranked 8, 10, 5, 4, kind of would show like, oh, this is the weak part of the proposal for this criteria. That might be helpful.
Okay. I can talk with the committee about how we think we might do that, because that's helpful feedback. The little purple highlighted thing, I know you can't really read it, but we just talked about adding one part, which was more clearly calling out how does this project clearly build on previous or current work without replicating efforts. So giving a little bit more context for how a given proposal feeds into what's happening. And one reason for that was, we have a really wide range of expertise on the panel, but not everyone is an expert in remote sensing or in microbialites. And so being able to have that context a little bit more laid out, as well as it's a way of discerning. It's a way of discerning sort of PI expertise. How do they understand how this piece is in, and can they explain it clearly? So, any feedback on that?
Does the tech team, like, all this data is produced and then it gets written out or published? Then what happens to that?
Yes, great question.
And is there an interest to have, like, you have all this data, we need someone to basically work it all together, funnel it for an end project for management or down the road or something like that? Like bundle it together.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So right now, our ways of sharing are the tech team meetings, where a lot of our presentations are people sharing about research that FFSL has funded. Sometimes it's not. For example, James' team today said, hey, we do interesting modeling too, let's share that. And that was really great, sort of partner sharing, but but a lot of our presentations come from being like, come share the results of what you gave us. But that's an interesting question. How does it keep living? Certainly our division is thinking about, oh, now we know more about this. How do we incorporate it? Right now we're updating our CMPs. So we're kind of trying to take a lot of things and synthesize it. But that's a great question, is how can we keep it more alive in terms of having people see it? And
I mean, Elliot, we're not a publishing division such as UGS, right? In the sense that we don't peer review things. Most of the, your publication, right, goes through your peer review system. I think it would be cool to have some way in which, they're annually published. I don't know how we would be able to facilitate that at our divisional level. But that's a very interesting point. How do you share this with the greater body other than everybody independently going off and publishing in whatever appropriate journal or OFR? That's a really good question.
Yeah, we do keep them in a repository online, so they are theoretically publicly available. I don't think they're that easy to find. I do know that UGS just made a new data hub for a lot of published papers, which is really great. So I think this is an ongoing conversation. How do we make this useful and accessible?
Yeah, and we have one for wetlands and groundwater.
And I don't know if UGS has a really phenomenal editorial team. I don't know if you can contract with them to do some of this work to get some of the papers out there.
Right now, they're just organized in folders by fiscal year, so you can dig through them and find stuff that's not searchable.
Yeah. So you kind of have to know what you're looking for before you can even approach finding it. And that's a good question. Quick thing, I know we're hitting time, so if you need to drop off, please do. Here's the timeline that I am aspiring to. I would love to get this application out by the beginning of October. That is 5 months, 6 months earlier than we have historically done it. But what that would let us do is open the application for 6 weeks. So let people apply, close it first or second week of November, depending on when we can get it out. Have the scoring and ranking subcommittee have about 5 weeks to do their scoring and ranking, knowing that we're hitting the holidays. So my dream would be to be able to tell grantees before people go on a winter break that the status of their proposal. That is ambitious, but because knowing that it might be hard to get the scoring and ranking team together in that sort of chopped up time. However, if that's possible, then the contracting, which has historically been extremely painfully slow, it could take 4 months and we'd still be fine. Oh, look at that. So this is the tentative timeline. There is some more preparation sort of just internally on my end and our team's end to finalize the application material, but wouldn't this be so great? Any feedback on this?
This example is showing fiscal year 26 projects, right? So you're saying it would be.
No, this would be fiscal year 27. So they would be able to start work in July of 2026, which is next July,
Yeah.
but it would be the funding would be the 27 funding, right? Have I got my numbers right?
So we're in 26.
Yes, we're in 26, right?
The application period would overlap with the GSL wet and the GSL water delivery program grants.
Yes.
Which means people might have to apply multiple times. Which would be
Yes.
a lot of work.
So that was my question. The BOR and the trust funds / FFSL are due October 24th. So theoretically, if we hit this timeline, it would give people a couple weeks overlap. But then, because the applications are fairly different, it's not like we could just copy and paste it. And it might be attracting totally different projects, but there would be some overlap. So this would fall on a really similar timeline. I think some pluses are people are already applying to be able to, adapt some things, copy and paste some parts of it and adjust other parts of it. One tricky part is just, it's a lot for people who are applying, and then the people who are scoring. I know that some of the folks are going to be scoring a lot of things in a very short amount of time. I did think about pushing it. So like, what if we did it a month and a half later so that it's not overlapping at all? I just worry about then sort of a domino effect, but that's possible if that feels like too much. So that's one of the big questions that I had was, is this timing too much? It's too much. And I wish we had some more academic people here to.
Oh, Bill has questions.
Oh, sorry. Oh, Bill, there you are. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, my mic took a while. Can you hear me now? You guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. So this is great. This is super helpful for people who are trying to put field work into their project, because if you wait until, you need to know by early spring in order to plan. And so this is going to be a big improvement. But I'm wondering about this gap between March and July. That's prime field work time. And I realize there may be a contracting reason for that July start. And so really the question becomes, is any work that's done in that April, May, June period sort of informal, or can it be formalized to allow the project to start in, say, April?
That's a good question. So we're really limited by the fact that our funds are lapsing and we have to spend them in the fiscal year that they're allocated for. What do you call that? What do you call it when the legislature gives you money? Anyway, so the answer really is no, we can't backdate it.
Okay.
But that is one reason why we are trying to do these 2 years so that people can sort of plan forward. So for the fiscal year 27, I don't think we can go back and say, go ahead and start it in April. So in the proposals, it would be pretty clear, hey, this has to start in July. If you want to go into the next year or use the next 2 fiscal years, that's fine. But we're just weirdly and artificially bounded in our projects by the fiscal year. And so
it's acceptable, because as long as there's a contract, people can go out with confidence and start working, even though I understand what binds you. But the fact is that field work becomes almost untenable in July and you have to start earlier. But
right.
This is acceptable. This is a huge improvement.
Oh, good. I think what we would do is say, understand that the proposal that we would be funding is a July to June idea. But if you can find different funding for that, we'd love to have it be a cohesive project. We were saying someone else or a university or whatever is funding February through June. And as soon as this funding hits, this is what we would do with that. So again, giving it that broader context of how it's fitting into what's happening, knowing that our funds do have to be pretty slotted into where they belong.
Or if you needed to collect a complete data set through a full field season, you just apply for 2 years.
Yep.
And you could easily explain that in the proposal.
Yes, yeah. So, right, so if you aren't gonna start until the next spring, but then you'd go through the next fall, that would make sense as a 2-year project, even though, you know, you aren't kicking off in July.
But you couldn't do any carryover from April to June for your work, carry it over after you're awarded that fiscal year, and then just say, hey, we did all this work. Now we can
Right.
fund it for it.
Right, I think our finance team would look at those receipts and be like, this doesn't, we can't pay this out for work that doesn't match the fiscal year. Sorry. Great, Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna reiterate that this is, I think, a really nice change for the academics. Knowing earlier for fieldwork, as Bill just mentioned, but also to get students to do this starting later was really so cumbersome and so hard. So thank you for making this change.
Yeah. Well, you know, aspirational, my guess is what is possible that happens is just internally it takes us a few weeks to pull things together and everything gets bumped about 3 weeks, which means that there would be less overlap with the other applications and people might be informed in January of their proposal, but that would still be, I think, much better than what's happening now.
Helps manage our time too.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like finish the other project and then you have one waiting for you.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. If you have, oh, yes, sorry.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I don't think I saw water quality among the areas that would help inform management decisions.
You know, and that is an interesting point because our division doesn't directly manage water quality, but that is a really important management aspect.
Right.
So that's a
The
great
integration of
suggestion.
that information.
Yeah, we'll think about how to,
Thank you.
how to bring
Thanks.
that in. Yes.
So are you pretty firm on the topics then, or will you be discussing it with your team? Just because, like what Lynn just brought up, there's biological aspects that are omitted. And I raised this before at a meeting, and then Stireman responded specific to birds, was my question, and the dependence on this incredible resource. And without it, we're losing very significant portions of populations of different species. There's mention of birds, biology throughout some of the questions, but it's not really called out. And I'm just wondering if you all can rethink how to structure your topics so that they're a little more equitable, less, they're very loaded.
I think just to back that up, there's huge public interest in birds. I mean, honestly, like all the work we do is kind of like done under the wings of like bird ecology. So,
under the wings.
so I think it's worth putting it in there because it's what some people care about.
Okay, that's helpful feedback because these funds are coming through FFSL. And again, we work in partnership with DWR, but we don't directly manage the birds. But I think because this is a major source of Brady funding for research, all research, that's great feedback. I'll take that back to the team. We'll chew out because I agree that there are all kinds of connections, but nothing direct here. Thank you. Okay, thanks, folks. The last items on our agenda are public comments and then any member updates or research. So open to the public comment. This is where anyone, including the public, can make a comment. Yes.
On October 9th, Friends of Great Salt Lake is having their annual fall fundraiser. So information is on our website, fogsl.org. I look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Great. Any other updates, research issues? Great. Our next meeting is going to be December 9th here. Same time, same place. Will you please remember to sign out on that sign-in sheet on your way out? It's a helpful way for us to remember who's here and keep track of things. Thank you so much for being here, for your input, for your questions, for the presentations. We look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.